Emerson woke up early, as it usually happened in his life, in a small, quiet town located on the Atlantic Ocean in Maine. The nature here was amazingly beautiful, and morning rituals such as a cup of hot coffee on the porch became something familiar to him, as if an integral part of his being. The day that started normally suddenly took on a new, unexpected direction. This time, when he came out onto the porch with a steaming cup in his hands, his gaze caught on the house opposite, which had stood empty and abandoned for a long time. The house was old but sturdy, with classic New England architecture. Columns at the entrance, a sagging but still majestic roof, wide windows that had not seen the light for a long time. No one could say exactly when it was last inhabited, and Emerson, like all the other residents of the small town, used to perceive it as part of the local landscape, motionless, abandoned, causing only a slight feeling of nostalgia for the old days. But on this day, everything changed. Emerson noticed that something was going on. A huge truck with metal structures and bright blue containers parked at the entrance. The car didn't look like a standard furniture van, more like something out of science fiction. The strange devices and objects that were unloaded by the workers had nothing to do with the usual boxes and boxes of furniture. One object resembled a giant sphere that slowly rotated as if it were alive. The other was a silver column with a smooth surface and mysterious symbols on the sides. His attention quickly shifted to the woman who was standing quietly next to the car, overseeing the unloading. Her figure was elongated and slender. Even from a distance, she looked like she was made of a different material than the people around her. Her hair was dark and thick, touching her shoulder blades, and fell down her back in soft, flowing waves. She was wearing a strange silver cape that seemed to be made of an unusual material, shiny and shimmering in the sun. Her clothes were thin, light as morning mist, but she moved with them as if she had a will of her own. Her movements were flawlessly smooth. Every detail of her gait, turn of her head or arm seemed thoughtful and precise. She moved as if she controlled the very reality around her. Despite the apparent fragility of her figure, there was a hidden strength and confidence in her every step, which struck Emerson. Her presence was almost mystical, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. She was not just beautiful, her beauty was unearthly. She captured attention, but remained unfathomed. He didn't know what to think. No one in the town mentioned that someone was going to buy this house, and certainly did not hint at such a mysterious person. A small town where everyone knew each other, and suddenly there was a stranger who looked like she came from another time or even a world. Emerson stared at her, not daring to step out of his comfort zone and go say hello. One part of him demanded to know more, to approach this mysterious woman, and the other part, cautious, innate shyness, forced him to stay in place to observe from afar. She turned around. Her eyes were what completely unsettled Emerson. He had never seen such eyes. They were unnaturally bright, as if they were glowing from within. Their color was so intense that for a moment Emerson thought he was looking straight into the cold starlight. The deep green hue shimmered with silvery sparks, as if her pupils were made up of many tiny lights, as if she carried a part of the cosmos. Her gaze swept over the surroundings, and Emerson held his breath for a moment when he felt that she was looking direct. Their eyes met, but instead of embarrassment or discomfort, he felt strangely calm. There was no hint of reproach or displeasure in her gaze, just a calm and attentive study. It wasn't the kind of look that ordinary people cast at each other. There was no familiar earthly awkwardness or social tension in him, as if she didn't know what the right view should be in this situation. Her eyes were clear, but there was a hidden meaning in them that Emerson couldn't immediately decipher. A few moments passed, but it seemed like time stretched out. The woman continued to watch the unloading, showing no apparent interest in what was happening nearby. Her calmness was almost hypnotic, and Emerson felt increasingly cut off from reality. He realized that he couldn't just stay away without knowing who this woman was and where she came from. Later that evening, he saw her again. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in warm orange and pink hues. The woman stood outside her house, looking around the area, as if delving into every detail of the world around her. Emerson was watching her discreetly from his window. He felt that there was something elusive about her, something that he could not understand or explain, but it attracted him more and more. There was nothing aggressive in her gestures. On the contrary, her every step was like a dance. She moved like a part of nature, without disturbing the harmony around. The next day, Emerson, still feeling inner discomfort because of his curiosity, went outside and went to a store in the city center. He hoped that one of the locals would tell him something about the new neighbor, but the town was small and no one knew the information. This only increased his desire to figure out who she was. Returning home, he noticed her again. She was standing by the fence that separated their plots and looking at the flowers in her garden. At one point, Her hand slowly reached out to one of the plants, and to his surprise, the flower seemed to come to life under her touch. The petals began to shimmer with new, brighter colors as if responding to her presence. Emerson stopped a few steps away, his heart pounding faster than usual. It was something completely unreal, something that was beyond his comprehension. Deep down, he knew that this was not just a new neighbor who came from another state or country. Something about her behavior, her appearance, and those strange objects she brought with her told him that she might not be from this planet. As he passed by, he decided to pluck up the courage and greet her. They exchanged a brief glance, and a faint smile lit up her face. Emerson felt a surge of excitement, but at the same time, there was something extraordinarily warm and reassuring in that look and in that smile. Her presence was calming, although he still couldn't figure out where she was from or what she was doing in his small town. Over the next few days, Emerson spent more and more time trying to figure out how to approach her. She remained mysterious, quiet, and distant, but every time he saw her, his interest and desire to know her grew. Their meeting at the border of the plots, when she looked at him as if exploring his soul, remained with him like an unsolved mystery. That's how the story began. The story of a strange, almost magical neighborhood which hid a much greater depth than Emerson could ever have imagined. After Emerson decided to say hello to Xantha, their relationship began to develop gradually and cautiously, as if they were both standing on the edge of something new and unknown, not knowing what each new step would bring them. The meeting at the fence, where their eyes met for the first time, was the very beginning from which the thin threads of their future connection began to sprout. But then they still couldn't imagine where all this would lead them. The world in which they both existed was so different that their every gesture, every meeting was an act of exploring each other and this new space between them. After that day, Emerson often noticed Xanthe in her garden. She spent a lot of time there, which was a bit strange for a new resident of the city. Usually, when people moved into a new house, they focused on the interior, but Xanthe seemed to pay attention mainly to her external environment. She stood for hours among the plants, her hands slowly sliding over the stems and leaves, as if she were a part of this living world, organically woven into its rhythms. Over and over again, Emerson found himself unable to take his eyes off her, watching her through the window or from his porch. He increasingly noticed how her presence affected the world around him. The plants around her seemed to come alive under her hands, becoming brighter, fuller, or sometimes it even seemed to him that the flowers were literally watching her, turning their buds in her direction, as if they were reaching for her. There was something mysterious about it that defied explanation, but every time he tried to figure it out, his mind was confronted with something that defied logic. Emerson was a practical man himself. His life in this quiet town was calm and orderly, devoid of dramatic twists. He was happy with his job, his home, and his usual daily routine. But now this new neighbor has turned everything upside down without doing anything special. Just being there, making him feel her presence on every cell of his skin. Her unusual beauty, her strange but attractive habits, and, of course, the fact that she was an alien. All this created an invisible barrier between them that Emerson did not know how to overcome. However, at the same time, this barrier became something of a challenge for him. The day after their brief meeting, Emerson saw her again by his garden. This time, he plucked up the courage and decided to come closer. He watched her for a while before she noticed him. She stood among the flowers, her long fingers gently touching the petals, and her eyes were fixed somewhere in the distance, as if she saw not only physical reality, but also something deeper, hidden from ordinary view. Emerson walked up to her and stood a few steps behind her, trying not to disturb her concentration. When she turned around, her face remained calm, but there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze. Emerson felt his heart quicken its rhythm for a moment, but not out of fear, but rather from the fact that he was next to something indescribable, not from this world. He took a cautious step forward, still not saying a word, but with a gesture indicating that he just wanted to be there, to be a part of this moment. He met his gaze with the same impenetrable calm, but there was a gleam of understanding in her eyes, as if she already knew what he wanted to express. From that moment on, a silent dialogue began between them. They didn't need words to understand each other, and Emerson quickly realized that their communication was on another level. While ordinary people exchanged words, they communicated through gestures, looks, and shared experiences that took place against the background of nature. Sometimes Xantha showed him something in her garden, some unusual flower that seemed to bloom especially brightly only at her touch. Person, not being a botanist, could not explain these phenomena, but each time they amazed him. Her garden became their meeting place. It was a space where they could be together without feeling the pressure of time or social norms. Her slow, smooth movements calmed him, and being next to her, he felt that time was slowing down, losing its meaning. Each of their meetings was filled with silence, but in this silence, Emerson found something more than in any conversation. Xantha didn't need words to express her thoughts or feelings, and soon he began to realize that this silent dialogue was more natural for her. Every day their communication became deeper. Emerson became more and more attached to Xantha. This feeling did not grow in the way that people usually do. It wasn't just sympathy or attraction, it was something more complicated, more mysterious. Her presence filled his life with indescribable energy. When he was with her, he felt that his world was getting wider, and his understanding of reality was beyond what he had ever known. Xantha gradually began to share her observations with him. She showed him not only the world through the prism of her perception, but also the subtle connections that she felt between all living beings. It wasn't just a story about life on another planet or its culture. It was something more, a perception of the world based on energy flows, harmony, and balance. She could touch a tree, and Emerson felt that tree come alive under her touch. She could look at the clouds, and there was something in that look that made him feel like she understood a lot more than just watching the weather. Every day, Emerson delved more and more into her unique world. He no longer saw her as just an alien, a mysterious creature from distant worlds. Now she was something more to him, a being who was opening up new horizons for him. He could feel a bond forming between them that went beyond ordinary human relationships. It was something inexplicable, but as natural as breathing. Their walks in the garden became a daily ritual. They walked in silence, sometimes only exchanging brief glances that were full of meaning. Sometimes Xantha showed him the stars they saw in the night sky, and there was longing in her gaze, as if she was looking not just at distant luminaries, but at a house that remained somewhere out there beyond their world. Emerson never asked her how she felt, but he knew that her inner world was filled with something deep and mysterious. He began to feel her loneliness, her isolation from her native world, but at the same time, he understood that she had found some kind of solace in him. During one of these stargazing nights, as they sat on the grass next to each other, Emerson felt his attraction to her grow stronger. It wasn't just curiosity or sympathy. It was an attraction that couldn't be ignored. He knew it wasn't just chemistry. It wasn't just a physical reaction. It was something deeper. He looked at Xantha and realized that she was something special in his life. She brought with her not only riddles, but also a new meaning. But there was something frightening about the same feeling. Emerson couldn't ignore the fact that the Xantha was different, not only biologically, but emotionally as well. Their worlds were too far apart, but despite that, he couldn't stop what was happening between them. He began to feel that he was becoming attached to her on a level that was not familiar to him. This feeling was inevitable, like gravity pulling you towards it, not allowing you to resist. Xantha seemed to feel it too. She looked at him as if she knew how he felt. Her eyes shone with the same cold starlight, but there was a hint of understanding in that light. She knew that their relationship was becoming something more, but she remained calm and motionless, as if she was preparing for what was about to happen. It all started with a slight excitement, barely noticeable to Emerson. Every time he saw Xantha in her garden, his heart began to beat a little faster and his thoughts became confused, even if he remained calm outwardly. This feeling of attraction, which at first was barely perceptible, like a faint breeze at dawn, gradually intensified. It grew with every glance they took, with every moment they were together. Xantha's unusual beauty, her mysterious manner, and incredible calmness thrilled Emerson, filling his entire consciousness. But this attraction was not just a physical attraction, although her refined features, mysterious eyes, and smooth movements generated a storm of emotions in him. It was something deeper, invisible, but tangible. There was an invisible thread between them that stretched from Emerson's heart and wrapped around Xantha, as if they were both parts of one whole, separated by time and space. He felt this connection growing as his affection became stronger and deeper, gradually filling his mind and body. Initially, it was just admiration. Xantha seemed to embody everything unearthly and unusual that Emerson had ever seen. Her movements, smooth, precise, and filled with inner harmony, fascinated him. He noticed how she could stand among her plants for hours, as if she were a part of this living world. But with every day they spent together, Emerson began to notice that this admiration was turning into something more. He was waiting for their meetings as if they were necessary, as if only next to her he could feel real peace and tranquility. His heart started racing every time he saw her. As soon as they were together, the world around them disappeared. The town with its noises, people, and even nature became just a backdrop for what was happening between them. And despite her seeming detachment and mystery, Emerson began to realize that Xanthe also felt this invisible connection. Her glances, which she sometimes cast in his direction, became longer and deeper, as if she was trying to read something in his soul. Emerson could no longer ignore his feelings. Each of their silent interactions became something special for him. He found meaning in her every move, in every gesture. Sometimes she just stood there, barely touching his shoulder with her hand, and there was more to it than in all the words he could have said. Her presence became like an attractive force for him, from which he could not and did not want to run away. This feeling permeated him, made his heart contract with quiet happiness and expectation of something more. And yet, no matter how strongly he felt this attraction, Emerson could not help but notice the barriers that stood between them. It wasn't just cultural differences, it was a whole world separating them from each other, and there was part of another civilization and her way of life. A perception of the world was radically different from everything that Emerson knew and understood. She didn't perceive the world around her the way people did. Her view of nature, of time, of feelings was so alien to Emerson that sometimes he felt his mind literally getting confused trying to understand her. But this attraction, like an invisible force, continued to grow. It became an integral part of his life. Emerson could no longer imagine his day without thinking about Xanthe. He found himself waiting for the moment when he could see her again, feel her presence next to him. Each of their brief moments together was filled with something special that could not be described in words. One day, during another walk through her garden, Emerson suddenly realized that she also felt this attraction. It was barely noticeable, but there was something new in her behavior, in her movements. She became a little closer to him physically. Sometimes their hands would accidentally touch each other, and each time it was like a flash, an instantaneous charge of energy that permeated both of them. Emerson felt it, but couldn't find the words to express his feeling. It seemed to him that words would be superfluous, that their connection did not need to be explained. At one of these moments, when they were standing in silence among the flowers, Xanthe suddenly looked up at him. It was the look that Emerson remembered from their first meeting. There was something inexplicable about him, but this time he felt her opening up to him. Her eyes, full of the light of distant stars, expressed what she couldn't say out loud. Emerson realized that she felt the same way. It was not just an exchange of glances, it was a confirmation that there was a connection between them that went beyond earthly concepts. That evening, on his way home, Emerson couldn't think of anything else but her. He felt like he was connected to her on some deep level that he hadn't known about before. This attraction was not physical in the usual sense. It was about something more important. He knew that he couldn't get away from this feeling. No matter how hard he tried, it grew inside him, becoming stronger and more inescapable. One day, when they met again in her garden, Emerson felt his feelings for Xanthe reach their peak. They stood side by side, enjoying the silence. Birds were singing all around, and the wind was playing with the leaves of the trees. But Emerson could hear nothing but her breathing, quiet and measured. He felt that he could no longer hide his feelings, but at the same time he realized that there were no words for this. All he could offer was his presence, his heart, which had belonged to her from the moment she appeared in his life, and seemed to sense this moment too. She slowly turned her head towards him, her eyes glittering in the light of the fading sun. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Emerson realized that they both knew this moment was inevitable. There was a tension between them that was almost palpable. It was like a magnetic field pulling them towards each other, not allowing them to stay at a distance. They stood side by side, but were silent. Everything was in that silence. Their attraction, their emotions, their insoluble differences. Emerson felt their physical and emotional distance shrink. They were no longer just neighbors or casual acquaintances. They were becoming more than just two beings who came from different worlds. Their feelings were deeper than could be described. Every day, their relationship became more complicated. Emerson felt that something more was growing between them. But he also understood that this connection required sacrifices. He couldn't ignore the fact that Xanthe was part of another world. No matter how strongly they were attracted to each other, reality remained reality. But every moment spent with her made this reality more hazy and unimportant. The attraction between them grew like an invisible force that was impossible to resist. And although they rarely exchanged words, their silence spoke more than any conversation. Emerson felt that their relationship had gone beyond human understanding, and it was both frightening and delightful. The attraction between Emerson and Xanthe has become an undeniable reality of their lives. It was inevitable, like the ebb and flow of the sea, and every day their feelings became deeper and more mutual. However, soon hidden obstacles began to appear, which did not appear immediately, but became clearer every day. At first, Emerson only intuitively felt that their connection was facing something invisible, elusive, like an invisible wall that they both tried to overcome, but could not fully comprehend its nature. Xanthe was a creature from another world, another civilization, and although she and Emerson looked quite similar on the outside, their differences turned out to be much more significant on the inside. The exterior was just a shell, but behind it was a chasm between their perceptions of reality, culture, and emotions. At first, these differences seemed small, almost imperceptible, but gradually, they began to manifest themselves more and more. The first bell for Emerson was his sense of time. Time passed differently for Xanthe than it did for him. Her life, her inner rhythm were unusual for Emerson. It seemed that she did not feel the need to hurry, did not feel the pressure of time as he did. For Emerson, every day was a conscious step forward. He felt the fragility of time, its elusive nature. But Xanthe lived in a rhythm that was smoother, calmer, not subject to haste. Sometimes Emerson felt that she saw time not as a linear flow, but as something eternal, endless, where each moment is no different from the other. He had to think more and more often that their life rhythms were incompatible. He noticed how they reacted to the same events in different ways. If for Emerson some moment was important, filled with significance, requiring action or reaction, Xanthe could remain calm. Her emotions and reactions never met his expectations. There was something alien about it. She perceived reality as if every moment was just part of an eternal cycle that did not need to be rushed. Emerson increasingly thought that these differences were not just features, but deep fundamental differences in the perception of life. At times, it seemed to him that he was spending his strength fighting against her equanimity, trying to involve her in the earthly perception of time, into which every minute of his existence was woven. But Xanthe did not give in to this rhythm. For her, there was no here and now as it was for people. She was living outside the time frame, and Emerson began to realize that this could be a serious obstacle in their relationship. Another important difference was their perception of the nature of emotions. Emerson, like any other person, was raised in a world where emotions were not only an important part of life, but also a way of expressing feelings, establishing connections between people. However, Xanthe, although she showed interest in Emerson, remained emotionally detached. Her face rarely expressed any strong feelings. Her gestures were calm and even, and although their bond seemed strong, Emerson could not understand how deeply she felt what was happening. It created an emotional barrier. Emerson was waiting for her to show emotions, which she did not seem to be able to give in the volume that was familiar. He tried to read her behavior, but every time he encountered her serenity, almost indifference, although he knew that it was not real coldness. She just didn't perceive emotions the way he did. Her culture, her biology were too far from his human perception of feelings. Sometimes Emerson found himself thinking that he would never be able to fully understand what was going on inside her. Xanthe couldn't express affection the way humans did. Her culture, her world, did not have such concepts as romantic love or affection in the form in which they existed on Earth. For her, everything was part of a harmony that she felt on a deeper level. It was a different way of expressing intimacy, unrelated to the usual human manifestations of feelings. She was devoted to her world and how she understood it. But Emerson began to realize that perhaps he and she would never be able to fully synchronize on an emotional level. This moment was a serious test for Emerson. He began to wonder if they could even exist as a couple despite all their differences. What about the fact that she does not share earthly traditions, earthly forms of expression of love and affection? Xanthe was a mystery that defied his understanding. Even when they were close, Emerson felt that there was an invisible distance between them that would never disappear. Another important feature that highlighted their differences was the perception of physical intimacy. For Emerson, as for any person, physical intimacy was an important part of a relationship. But he quickly realized that for Xanthe it did not matter so much. Her body and her perception of physical interactions were different. They could spend time together enjoying each other's presence, but Emerson increasingly noticed that her approach to intimacy had nothing to do with how people understood it. Her touches were rare, but when they happened, they were filled with a completely different meaning. Emerson could feel it. There was something in her every move that transcended physical reality. Her touch could awaken feelings in him that could not be expressed in words. But at the same time, he felt that it was not enough to fully understand her world. Xanthe didn't need physical contact the way humans did. For her, everything was connected with more subtle energy connections that Emerson could not comprehend. At first, it seemed to him that this only strengthens their bond, makes it something more unique than the usual earthly relationship. But soon he began to notice that this difference was becoming more and more difficult to overcome. He expected more interaction from her, more physical expression of intimacy, but Xanthe remained aloof. even if she genuinely cared about him. For her, their emotional and spiritual connection was more important than any physical interaction, but Emerson, for all his openness, could not ignore his own human needs. He was increasingly asking questions about the future of their relationship. No matter how strongly they were attracted to each other, these differences continued to become a barrier. He understood that they were both at different levels of perception, that their culture, their nature were too different. And although their bond seemed strong and unique, more and more often he had to doubt that it could last for a long time. Emerson also began to realize that Xantha lived in harmony with nature in a completely different way than he did. For her, every element of the world around her was connected to her inner world. She could stand for hours among the trees, feeling their energy. Her body literally merged with nature. She understood the world as something unified, in which every element had its place. Emerson, despite his love of nature, always remained a bystander. He felt detached from the world around him, not part of this harmony that Xantha felt so easily. This aspect has also become a point of tension. Emerson became increasingly aware that he could not separate her attitude to nature and her perception of harmony. He was a part of the human world where people sought to control nature rather than merge with it. This difference was becoming obvious to him, and he realized that he would never be able to feel the same connection with the world that Xantha felt. She was a part of this world on a deeper level while he was only a temporary guest. Gradually, all these differences began to add up to one big obstacle that they could not overcome. Emerson increasingly felt that their attraction was facing serious challenges. He began to wonder if they could exist together despite all their feeling. It hurt him to realize that there would always be this barrier between them that might never go away. With each passing day, tension between Emerson and Xantha grew due to unresolved cultural and biological differences. Their attraction was undeniable, and every moment spent together seemed filled with hidden energy. However, what had previously seemed natural and harmonious was now beginning to raise questions and doubts. Emerson was a man born into a world where feelings and emotions were expressed through words, touches, and gestures. Xantha, on the other hand, was a creature from another reality. Her perception of emotions and time was radically different from what Emerson used to consider the norm. Their bond has become so strong that it has become impossible to ignore the differences. The first signs of internal conflict appeared at the moment when Emerson began to realize that their relationship, no matter how special it was, could be insurmountable. Despite her obvious attraction to him, Xantha never showed emotion the way humans. She did not express her feelings in the usual ways for him. There were no sudden outbursts of passion, long hugs, or words of love that could dispel his doubts. Her presence was always calm, and although she was with him, her inner world remained a mystery to him. Emerson increasingly noticed that their physical interaction was different from ordinary human communication. Xantha, although she was there, did not feel the same need for physical intimacy, which was natural and important for him. Her touches were rare, but they were filled with a depth that he could not always comprehend. In those moments when Emerson wanted more intimacy, he felt that Xantha found satisfaction in invisible and subtle connections that did not require physical confirmation. Despite this, they continued to stay close. The time spent together was filled with silence, which had a special meaning for both of them. Every moment they shared was filled with an atmosphere of expectation, as if something important was about to happen, but they were both afraid to admit it. Emerson found himself thinking more and more about Xantha. He couldn't figure out how to overcome this invisible wall that seemed indestructible. But at the same time, he felt that every day, something more than just affection was growing between them. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing doubts. At times, Emerson felt on edge. He didn't know if he could handle the tension that arose from their differences. His human nature demanded familiar forms of expression of love, and Xantha, no matter how hard she tried, could not give him what he was used to. She was mysterious, and this attracted him, but at the same time, her incomprehensibility caused an internal conflict in him. Will he be able to truly accept her for who she is, or will their differences eventually destroy what they have already created? Everything changed one evening when Emerson and Xantha, as usual, were sitting together in her garden. This time, the atmosphere was different, tense and intense, as if something was in the air, invisible but tangible. The night wind rustled around them, the leaves rustled in the dark, and the star-studded sky seemed closer than usual. Emerson felt that something was going to happen, as if it was predetermined. Anassa stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze directed towards the sky. At that moment, she seemed even more distant than usual, as if her mind was thousands of light years away. Emerson looked at her, and his heart was filled with both love and anxiety. He understood that despite their connection, she would always belong to another world. The thought tore at him from the inside out. But at the same time, he knew that he could no longer hide his feelings. What he was experiencing was too strong to ignore it further. Emerson stood next to her, and the moment their eyes met, he realized that something important was going on between them. It was the moment when all their hidden feelings, all their contradictions and fears suddenly surfaced. Nanchane's gaze was deep and penetrating, as if she could see his soul. And although she didn't say a word, Emerson suddenly felt that she understood everything he wanted to say. It was the moment when words became superfluous. It was then that something amazing happened. Emerson felt Xanth begin to reveal to him her inner world, which had been a mystery to him all this time. It wasn't expressed in words or physical touch. It was a feeling as if there was an invisible connection between them, even deeper than before. He felt her presence on a new level that had previously been inaccessible to him. In her eyes was the whole universe, distant worlds, starlight, millennia of experience that she could not convey to him in the usual ways. Emerson suddenly realized that their relationship was beyond human comprehension. It was more than just the attraction of two bodies or souls. It was a feeling of deep, invisible energy connection that connected them on a level that defies explanation. On Xanth, they could never express it in words or actions because her feelings existed on another invisible level. It wasn't Emerson's usual love, but it was something he couldn't reject. The feeling of her opening up to him was almost overwhelming. Emerson suddenly realized that Xanthi also had feelings for him, but her way of expressing herself was so alien to human experience that he couldn't understand it before. For her, love was not something that could be expressed through the forms familiar to him. It was a much more complex and profound feeling that existed on the edge of perception. Emerson suddenly realized that all this time he had been trying to apply his own human patterns to her, trying to make her feel and react the way people did. But Xanthi was different. Her world was different, and her love was different too. She didn't need words, touches, or other familiar expressions of feeling. Her presence was in itself an expression of her affection. From that moment on, their relationship changed. Emerson no longer tried to seek confirmation of her feelings in the forms he was used to. He began to realize that their bond was much deeper than he could have imagined. Agatha didn't need to talk about her feelings. She expressed them on a level that was almost beyond the comprehension of an ordinary person. And although it was difficult for Emerson, he began to accept this new reality. Their moments together now seemed filled with a new meaning. Emerson began to feel that they were connected not only on a physical and emotional level, but also on a spiritual one. He felt her presence even when she was silent, and that silence became as important to him as words. Nancy was there, and that was enough. She didn't need to express her feelings in the usual ways. Her love was in her gaze, in her presence, in her energy that surrounded them both. From that moment on, their relationship moved to a new level. Emerson stopped struggling with what he couldn't understand. He accepted Xanthine's nature for what it was and realized that her love for him was real. She just expressed it differently. A feeling of peace came over him, and his doubts began to disappear. Now he knew that their bond was special, even if it didn't fit into the usual framework. They continued to spend time together, but now there was complete harmony between them. Emerson no longer felt the need to receive confirmation of her love. He knew that she was there, that their bond was strong, even if she remained invisible to others. After Emerson and Xantha found a new level of mutual understanding and accepted the uniqueness of their bond, a deep sense of harmony was established between them. It seemed that all doubts and disagreements had been overcome, but the feeling of inevitability of choice continued to grow, hidden under the surface of their relationship. Emerson knew that the moment of decision was still ahead, like a shadow that grows as it approaches sunset. Their bond, no matter how unique and deep it was still faced with a reality that was too complicated to ignore. The time they spent together became even more intense. Emerson began to see the world through Xanthi's eyes, and his perception of nature and reality changed. He learned to notice subtle energy connections between living beings, to see harmony in every element of the surrounding world, which he had not realized before. It seemed that his inner self began to expand, to go beyond the usual. Auntie's presence affected him more deeply than he would have guessed. Now, he was not just a man who loved a mysterious alien. He was part of her world, her reality, and yet despite this profound internal change, the realization that their relationship was facing a serious choice continued to grow in him. On the one hand, he understood that they could continue to live in this state of harmony taking differences for granted and adapting to them. However, on the other hand, their bond was still fragile due to unresolved issues. These questions concerned not only their cultural and biological differences, but also the future. Can they be together in the long run? What would their life be like if she decided to leave Earth, return to her home planet? Or, even more difficult, will Emerson stay on Earth if she decides to stay here? One of the most difficult topics to think about was the question of time. Emerson became increasingly aware that their perception of time remained one of the biggest obstacles. For Xantha, time was almost beyond her control. Her life flowed in a different rhythm, and her understanding of what the future was not the same as Emerson's. He saw time as a limited resource, every moment of which mattered. For Xantha, time was a part of eternity, with no clear boundaries between the present, the past, and the future. Emerson began to notice how this difference in time perception affected their relationship. Sometimes it seemed to him that for her, their relationship could exist indefinitely without requiring specific decisions or actions. But for Emerson, the question of the future was becoming more and more urgent. He was a man who lived within the limits of human time, and it was important for him to know what would happen next. However, every time he thought about it, he was faced with the realization that Xantha did not see the need for such reflections. She lived here and now, not thinking about what would happen in a year or a decade. Emerson began to feel an inner conflict. He couldn't ignore the fact that their relationship might be temporary. No matter how strongly they were connected, his heart continued to be troubled by the question, how long can this last? Can he build a life with a creature that belongs to another civilization, another time and space? And would he be able to cope with the fact that their relationship could end at any moment if she decided to return to her planet? These thoughts haunted him even when they were in complete agreement with each other. Emerson increasingly found himself wondering what would happen if their relationship proved impossible in the long run. He tried to imagine life without Xantha, and it seemed unbearable to him. She became more than just a love interest for him. She opened up a new world to him, showed him new facets of his own existence. He could no longer return to his former life when the world was black and white, and his emotions and perceptions were limited by earthly boundaries. One day, Emerson felt that he was approaching a crucial moment. It wasn't a sudden realization, but rather a gradual buildup of inevitability. He began to realize that their bond, no matter how strong their attraction, faced a choice. They would either find a way to overcome all these differences or break up. It was not a clear realization, but rather a feeling that the future was beginning to loom over them more and more, and it would not be possible to avoid this choice. The question of whether they can continue to live together has become more explicit. They both felt that their bond was something unique, but is it possible to build a future on such a foundation? Emerson couldn't completely ignore his human needs, and Xantha couldn't change her nature. At some point, Emerson began to realize that their love, no matter how amazing it was not capable of solving all their problems. It was then that Emerson realized that the future of their relationship depended on whether they could accept their imperfections and differences as something permanent. He began to think that perhaps their relationship was something temporary, but at the same time beautiful. Perhaps their love was not something that could be preserved forever, but something that should be appreciated in the moment. It wasn't a comforting thought, but it was real. Emerson knew that human nature requires certainty, and his life with Xantha would always be filled with uncertainty. He also understood that Xantha, no matter how much she was attached to him, would not change her identity for him. She was a creature from another world, another culture, and her perception of time, life, and love will always be different from the human one. Emerson felt that they were on the verge of accepting this fact. Either they can come to terms with the fact that their relationship will always balance on the edge between two worlds, or they will have to break up. Perhaps the hardest thing for Emerson was realizing that love is not always the solution to all problems. Sometimes love itself creates new difficulties, and no matter how strong the attraction, it is not always able to overcome all barriers. Emerson began to realize that their love was more than just a relationship between two beings. It was a meeting of two worlds, and these worlds could not always coexist in harmony. At some point, Emerson realized that he had to make a choice. This choice wasn't just about whether they could stay together, but also whether he could accept the reality of their differences. He had to decide if he was ready to live in a world where love did not guarantee stability, where their bond would always be threatened because of their nature. And although it was a difficult choice, Emerson knew that this decision had to be made. He began to think that maybe their relationship was meant to be temporary. But that didn't make it any less significant. Sometimes the most important things in life are the ones that can't last forever. Perhaps their love was just that something fleeting. But deep, that would leave a mark for a lifetime, even if their paths diverged. As time passed, Emerson felt the moment of separation or acceptance approaching. This choice hung in the air like a cloud that could not be avoided. He knew that the future of their relationship would depend on whether he could accept this uncertainty as part of his life. It was a challenge, and Emerson understood that not all challenges can be defeated. As Xanthi became more and more immersed in her world, in which there were no familiar human concepts about the future, Emerson realized that the future of their relationship could be just that: mysterious, unpredictable, and always in danger of disappearing.